1890. The Gobi Desert. British railway surveyors ignored the warnings of Mongolian shepherds. They said the sand moved without wind. They said something ancient lived in the deep desert, something that killed with fire and lightning. The surveyors laughed until the sheep started dying in perfect circles, until the ground exploded upward, until one of them was pulled screaming into the sand. This is the true account of the olgoi-khorkhoi, the Mongolian death worm. If this story terrifies you the way it should, subscribe now, because the desert remembers what we forget. The old shepherd made me swear never to camp near sand that moved without wind. He died 3 days later, fever taking him fast. I thought it was delirium. 40 years serving British trading companies along the Silk Road, and I'd never seen Badr frightened of anything. But that morning in June 1890, watching him grip my wrist with hands strong enough to break bone, I saw something in his eyes I couldn't name. Not yet. My name is William Ashford, and I came to the Gobi Desert as a surveyor for the Trans-Mongolian Railway Commission. The Russians wanted rails. The British wanted influence. I wanted distance from London and the life I'd left there. What I got was sand, wind, and silence so complete you could hear your own blood moving. Our camp sat 3 days' ride south of Ulaanbaatar, a collection of felt gears and supply wagons arranged in a loose circle. 22 men total, 12 Mongolian herders and guides, 8 British surveyors and engineers, 2 Russian observers who kept mostly to themselves. Badr had been our primary guide, a man of perhaps 60 years who knew every waterhole and grazing area for 200 miles. He'd grown up in these lands, following his father's herds across steppes that turned to desert, learning the old songs and the old warnings. The other herders respected him. Even our chief surveyor, Thomas Pemberton, deferred to Badr's judgment about weather and routes. The fever came sudden. One evening he was teaching me Mongolian words for different types of sand. Yes, they had dozens. And by dawn he couldn't stand. Our medical man, Dr. Whitmore, suspected pneumonia, though the coughing seemed wrong. Badr kept trying to tell us something, switching between Mongolian and broken English, grabbing at anyone who came near. The other herders wouldn't translate. They'd go silent, make small gestures with their hands that might have been prayers, and find reasons to leave the ger. Tsaren, the youngest of the guides, finally told me what Badr was saying. We stood outside in the cooling evening, the sun turning the western dunes copper and blood. Tsaren was 19, educated at a missionary school, caught between two worlds and comfortable in neither. He says the sand moved wrong yesterday, Tsaren said quietly. Near the southern wells, he says we need to move camp. The wind shifts sand, I said. That's rather its nature. No wind yesterday, Mr. Ashford. Still air all day. But he saw ripples in the dunes, like something underneath moving. I'd learned not to dismiss local knowledge. These men survived in a land that killed foreigners with casual efficiency. If they said don't camp near a certain type of rock, you didn't camp there. If they said a well was bad, you found another. But moving an entire survey camp based on sand ripples seemed excessive. What would cause that? I asked. Tsaren looked at the southern horizon, where the land became pure desert, where even the scrub grass surrendered. Olgoi-khorkhoi, he said. The intestine worm. It lives deep in the sand. It comes up when it's hungry. I'd heard the name before. Campfire stories. A creature thick as a man's arm, red like blood, no eyes or mouth visible, It killed with electricity or acid, depending on who told the story. Every remote place had its monster. Scotland had its Loch Ness creature. Nepal had its Yeti. Mongolia had its death worm. Has anyone actually seen one? I asked. Saren nodded slowly. My grandfather. Killed 6 sheep in one night, 1861. He said it came up through the sand so fast he couldn't track it. Just a red blur, and then the sheep were dead. Burned. The ground around them was scorched in circles. What happened to it? Nothing. It went back down into the sand. They moved the herd 50 miles north. He paused. My grandfather said the worst part wasn't the dead sheep. It was that the thing seemed angry, like they'd disturbed it, and it was punishing them. Badr Deen died that night. Dr. Whitmore said his heart simply stopped, likely weakened by the fever. The herders prepared the body according to their customs, and we buried him at dawn in the traditional way, laying him on the surface for the skis burial the eagles would complete. I'd seen it before. It was practical in a land where digging graves in hard ground was nearly impossible. Pemberton refused to move camp. We were on schedule, barely, and relocating would cost us a week. The Railway Commission had deadlines. London expected reports. Besides, he said, we couldn't abandon a major survey point because of folklore and an old man's fever dreams. The other British staff agreed. The Russian observers said nothing, which was their usual contribution. The Mongolian herders began sleeping with their horses hobbled close, and they stopped ranging as far during the day. I noticed they avoided the southern sections entirely, even though that's where the best grazing was supposed to be. 3 days after Badr Deen's death, Dorj found the first kill. Dorj was our best horseman, a quiet man of about 40 who could track anything across any terrain. He came back to camp at midday, riding hard, his horse lathered and wild-eyed. He went straight to the herders' section, and I heard raised voices, arguments in rapid Mongolian. Saren found me at the survey equipment. You should come see, he said. His face had gone pale, which was remarkable given his natural complexion. 4 sheep, dead in a rough line, maybe 20 yards between each carcass. But these weren't predator kills. No blood, no torn flesh. They looked almost peaceful except for their eyes, which had burst in their sockets, and the burns. The ground around each sheep showed scorch marks in perfect circles, maybe 6 feet across. The sand had turned to something like glass in places, dark and glossy. The sheep themselves had burn marks along their sides, but wrong somehow, not like fire burns. More like acid, the wool dissolved away, and the skin beneath blistered in patterns that reminded me of lightning strikes I'd seen on trees. What could do this? Dr. Whitmore knelt by the nearest carcass, his medical curiosity overriding his unease. Not lightning, Pemberton said. He was right. The sky had been clear for a week. Dorj spoke in Mongolian, and Saren translated. He says the sand was disturbed in a line, like something traveled underground from one sheep to the next. He tracked it south for half a mile. Then the trail disappeared, went deep. We stood in the hot silence, wind picking up dust around our boots. I thought about Badr Deen's warning, about sand that moved without wind, about things that lived in the deep desert, in places where water never reached and nothing should survive. Post watches tonight, Pemberton said finally. Probably some sort of exotic snake. Big one, granted. But snakes can't kill sheep without leaving tooth marks. We'll solve this rationally. But Dorj was shaking his head before Saren finished translating. He pointed south, toward the deep desert, and said something sharp. He says we need to leave, Saren told us. He says the sheep were a warning. When olgoi-khorkhoi kills livestock, it means humans have come too close to its territory. It's telling us to go. It's a worm, Pemberton snapped. If it exists at all, we're not abandoning a month of work because of a damned worm. That night I couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up, making the tent canvas snap and whisper. I kept thinking about those burn marks, perfect circles in the sand, about Bat Erdine's grip on my wrist, about the way the Mongolian herders had started sleeping in groups, keeping fires burning all night despite the waste of fuel. Around midnight, I gave up and walked out to the edge of camp. The moon was nearly full, turning the landscape silver in shadow. To the south, the desert stretched endless, dunes rising and falling like a frozen sea. I thought I saw something move. Not on the surface, beneath it. A ripple passing through a dune about 100 yards out, like something huge pushing up from below. The sand shifted, rose slightly, then settled. It moved in a line, heading east, then curved back south and disappeared. I stood there for 5 minutes, barely breathing, watching. Nothing. Just wind-shaped dunes and moonlight. I was turning back to camp when I heard it. A sound like nothing I'd heard before. Low frequency, almost below hearing, felt more than heard. It resonated in my chest, made my teeth ache. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, then stopped. The horses went mad, all of them simultaneously, screaming and pulling at their hobbles. The camp erupted, men shouting, lanterns lighting, the chaos of 22 people jerked from sleep by animal panic. It took us an hour to calm the horses, and even then they remained skittish, ears flat, eyes rolling white. Dorj and 2 other herders rode out at first light. I went with them against Saren's advice. We found more dead sheep, 8 this time, arranged in a wide circle about 2 miles south of camp. Same burns, same glassy sand. But this time there were tracks. Not footprints. A groove in the sand, deep and smooth, like something cylindrical had pushed through. It was perhaps 15 inches wide, and it wandered in loops and curves across a quarter-mile area before diving back into the sand. In the center of the dead sheep circle, we found something that made Dorj dismount and back away, making signs against evil. The sand there had been fused into a crater, smooth as melted wax, still faintly warm to the touch despite the dawn chill. And in that crater were marks, not quite writing, but deliberate. Parallel lines scored deep, arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence, purpose. It's claiming territory, I said aloud, though I'm not sure why. It just felt true. Dorj said something in Mongolian, harsh and certain. He says it's not claiming territory, Saren translated quietly. He says it's angry we're still here. He says this is the last warning, next time it comes for us. We rode back to camp in silence. The sun rose hot and merciless. Behind us, I could have sworn I felt something watching from beneath the sand, something patient and ancient and absolutely certain we would stay too long. I thought about Bat Erdine's last words, about sand that moved without wind. I thought about that sound in the night, resonating in my bones. And I thought about Pemberton's determination to keep surveying, to meet his deadlines, to bring the railway through no matter what the desert held. Some warnings, I was learning, came from men who'd paid attention, who'd listened when the land itself tried to speak. Bat Erdine had known. He'd tried to tell us. And we hadn't listened. Pemberton organized a hunt. Not because he believed in the death worm, he made that abundantly clear, but because something was killing livestock and frightening the men. And British surveyors didn't retreat from vermin, no matter how exotic. He assigned 6 men, himself, Dr. Whitmore, 2 of our engineers named Fletcher and Morrison, and 2 Russian observers who volunteered with unsettling enthusiasm. They took rifles, water for 2 days, and enough confidence to outfit an army. I stayed behind. Someone needed to continue the survey work, and besides, I'd seen those marks in the fused sand. Something about them suggested we were dealing with intelligence, not instinct. You don't hunt intelligent things in their own territory and expect to win. The hunting party left at dawn on the 4th day after Batterdeen's death. The Mongolian herders watched them ride south with expressions I'd learned to read. Resignation mixed with a particular sadness of watching fools march toward preventable death. But they said nothing. What could they say that hadn't already been ignored? Saren and I worked the survey line north of camp, taking readings, marking positions. It was mechanical work, which suited me fine. My hands were busy and my mind could wander to safer thoughts. London, my sister's last letter, anything except what might be happening in the southern desert. My grandfather said they're older than us. Saren said suddenly around midday. We were resting in the shade of our horses, drinking water that tasted of leather and dust. The worms? He nodded. Older than humans in the Gobi? Maybe older than humans anywhere. He said there used to be more of them, but the desert itself is dying, drying up. They go deeper now, sleep longer, but when they wake up hungry or when something disturbs their territory. He trailed off, looking south. How do they kill? Electricity? Acid? Both, maybe. Or something else we don't have words for. My grandfather said the ones who survived attacks described it as being burned from inside, like their blood turned to fire in their veins. Saren took another drink, then wiped his mouth. He also said they don't always kill. Sometimes they just make you afraid, project fear somehow, make your heart beat so hard it damages itself. I thought about Batterdeen's fever, his failing heart. Could fear alone kill a man? If he was old, already sick, and he'd seen one of these things before? Yes, I think so. The hunting party returned at dusk, minus 1 man. Fletcher was gone. They'd found more dead sheep, followed the track into a narrow canyon where the sand gave way to broken rock and ancient dried seabeds. Morrison said Fletcher had been walking point when the ground simply collapsed under him. Not collapsed, exploded upward in a geyser of sand and something red and glistening that moved faster than their eyes could track. Fletcher had fired once, wildly. Then he screamed. They'd all fired then, 20 rounds into the sand cloud, but the thing was already gone, pulling Fletcher down with it. They dug frantically, but the sand kept collapsing inward, and within minutes there was nothing but smooth desert surface, as if the ground had never been disturbed. Pemberton told the story in a flat voice, standing outside his tent while the whole camp listened. His hands shook slightly when he lit his pipe. Dr. Whitmore had a bandage on his left arm. Burned, he said, though he wouldn't elaborate. The 2 Russian observers stood apart, speaking in rapid whispers, and I noticed one of them kept glancing south with an expression that might have been hunger. We're leaving at first light, Pemberton announced. Pack everything essential. Abandon what we can't carry quickly. Nobody argued. The Mongolian herders had already started breaking down their jurs. They'd known this moment was coming. They'd just been waiting for us foreigners to accept it. That night, 'Nobody slept. We kept every fire burning, wasting fuel we'd need for the journey north. The horses remained agitated, pulling at their hobbles, whinnying at shadows. Around 10 o'clock, Morrison started crying. Quiet, steady tears he couldn't seem to stop. Dr. Whitmore gave him laudanum, but it didn't help. Morrison just sat there staring south, tears running down his sunburned face, whispering, "It's still there. Can't you feel it? It's still there." I felt it too. A pressure in the air, like before a thunderstorm, except the sky was clear and starred. That subsonic vibration returned, making my teeth ache, and this time it didn't stop. It continued for hours, rising and falling like breathing, coming from somewhere south of camp. Dorj and 3 other herders began singing. Old songs in Mongolian, low and rhythmic. Saren told me they were protective chants meant to ward off evil spirits. I didn't point out that we weren't dealing with spirits. If singing helped them feel safer, I had no objections. Besides, the sound was comforting, human voices asserting presence in a landscape that wanted us gone. Around midnight, the vibration changed tone, went higher. The horses screamed, and the sand started moving. Not wind-driven, not natural. A ripple pattern spreading toward camp from the south, multiple lines converging. Like something beneath the surface was circling us, testing our perimeter, looking for weakness. "Lights!" Pemberton shouted. "Get every lantern burning. Whatever it is, it must avoid light." But I wasn't sure about that. The moonlight was bright enough to read by, and the thing didn't seem bothered. The ripples came closer, within 50 yards of camp now, and I could see the sand actually rising in ridges as something beneath pushed upward. One of the Russian observers, Volkov, I think, suddenly grabbed a torch and started walking toward the nearest ripple. His companion tried to stop him, but Volkov shoved him away, shouting in Russian. He strode out past our firelight, torch held high, yelling what sounded like challenges or demands. The sand 30 feet ahead of him exploded upward. I got my first clear look at the olgoi-khorkhoi then, and I understood why the Mongolian herders had no precise description for it. The thing defied description. It was perhaps 4 feet long, thick as a barrel, segmented like an earthworm, but covered in what looked like dark red scales or plates that glistened wetly in the torchlight. No visible head, no eyes. Just a blunt front end that opened into something between a mouth and a sphincter, ringed with inward-pointing spines. But worse than its appearance was its movement. It didn't just writhe. It moved with purpose, with calculation. It rose from the sand, oriented on Volkov, and I swear it paused, as if considering him. The man stood frozen, torch shaking in his hands, his earlier bravado evaporated. The thing made a sound, not the subsonic rumble from before, but a high-pitched shriek that sent everyone stumbling backward, hands over ears. Volkov dropped his torch and fell to his knees. The creature lunged forward, not to attack but to circle him, moving around him in the sand so fast it blurred. And where it passed, the sand turned molten, glowing orange-red. Within seconds, Volkov was surrounded by a perfect circle of liquefied sand, and the heat radiating from it made the air shimmer. He tried to run, but the moment his boot touched that molten ring, he screamed and jerked back. The leather was smoking. The creature rose up in front of him, and I saw its front end pulse, saw something like electricity arc across its segments. Volkov's scream cut off abruptly. He spasmed once, twice, then collapsed. The olgoi-khorkhoi didn't take him. It simply sank back into the sand, the ripples moving away from camp, heading south. The molten ring around Volkov cooled and hardened within minutes, leaving him trapped in a cage of glass-fused desert. We pulled him out an hour later, once we were certain the creature had withdrawn. Volkov was alive but unresponsive, his eyes open and unblinking, his heart racing at a dangerous rate. Dr. Whitmore said it was shock. But I saw something else in those frozen eyes. Not just fear. Recognition. Like Volkov had seen something in that brief encounter, something that had broken whatever made him human. "It's playing with us," I said quietly to Tseren as we watched Whitmore try to treat Volkov. "It could have taken him. It didn't." "Not playing," Tseren said, "demonstrating, showing us what it can do. My grandfather said that's what they do. They make examples, show their power, give their prey one last chance to flee." He looked at me with exhausted eyes. "We need to leave now. Not at dawn. Now." Pemberton agreed. We broke camp in darkness, working by lantern light, loading wagons with shaking hands. We left survey equipment, personal effects, everything that wasn't essential. The Mongolian herders worked efficiently, their movements practiced. They'd fled predators before, knew the drill. We rode north in a column, 2 wagons and 21 mounted men. Fletcher gone, Volkov tied to a saddle in his catatonic state. The moon lit our way, and behind us I felt, rather than saw, the desert watching. Something ancient and territorial, satisfied that the intruders were finally leaving its domain. Around 3 in the morning, 5 miles north of camp, we passed through a section where the sand was disturbed in massive patterns. Circles within circles, grooves and ridges arranged in designs that suggested purpose, communication, perhaps warning. Tseren said his grandfather had seen similar patterns in 1861 after his sheep were killed. Ancient marks that predated human writing, messages from something that lived in the deep places of the earth. We didn't stop to study them. By dawn, we were 10 miles north, moving into the rocky steppes where grass returned and the sand grew thin. The horses finally calmed. Morrison stopped crying. Volkov remained frozen in his saddle, staring at nothing, but his heart rate had dropped to something approaching normal. Behind us, the Gobi Desert stretched silent and hostile under the rising sun. Somewhere beneath those dunes, something red and ancient was settling back into its territory, satisfied that the warnings had finally been heeded. I thought about Fletcher, pulled down into the sand, and wondered if he was still alive down there in the dark, or if death had come quickly. I thought about Bader Dean, who'd tried to warn us, who'd spent his last breath trying to make us understand. And I thought about all the other herders and travelers over the centuries who'd learned the same lesson. The desert keeps its secrets, and some territories belong to things older than human ambition. We reached Ulaanbaatar 6 days later, half-starved and sunburned, our horses lean and skittish. The British consulate gave us rooms, hot water, and a doctor for Volkov, who remained locked in his catatonic state. His companion, the other Russian observer named Petrov, sat vigil beside him, speaking in low Russian, sometimes weeping. Whatever had happened to Volkov went beyond physical trauma. His body functioned, but something essential had been extracted, leaving only breathing meat. Pemberton filed his report to the Trans-Mongolian Railway Commission with clinical precision. Equipment lost to sandstorm. 1 man dead in a collapse. Survey data incomplete. He recommended alternative routes, northern approaches, anything that avoided the southern Gobi. He didn't mention the olgoi-khorkhoi, didn't mention the burned sheep or the molten sand or Fletcher's screams as he was pulled underground. They wouldn't believe it, he told me over whiskey in the consulate lounge. And it doesn't matter what killed Fletcher, does it? Dead is dead. The railway will find another route. That's what matters. But his hand still shook when he lifted his glass. And he'd taken to sleeping with his door locked, a lamp burning all night. Rational explanations only carried a man so far when he'd seen the sand explode upward and something impossible emerge. Dr. Whitmore left for Moscow the next week, claiming family business. Morrison requested transfer to the Singapore office and was gone within a month. The Mongolian herders returned to their clans, spreading the story in the way such stories spread, quietly, around fires, to people who already half believed. Tsarin stayed in Ulaanbaatar. He'd secured work with a trading company, but I think he remained partly to keep an eye on me. We met for tea once a week at a Russian-run cafe, and he'd ask the same question. "When are you leaving?" Because I wasn't leaving. Not yet. The surveyors were gone, the railway commission had moved on, but I remained in Mongolia, supposedly wrapping up paperwork and equipment transfers. In truth, I was researching. The consulate had a modest library, and I spent days digging through accounts of Gobi exploration, missionary journals, trading company records, anything that might mention the olgoi-khorkhoi. The references were scattered, obscure, often dismissed as folklore. But patterns emerged. A Russian expedition in 1852 reported livestock deaths near the southern wells, circular burns, no predator marks. A Chinese trading caravan in 1807 lost 3 men to what they described as sand serpents that breathe lightning. A Mongolian historical text from the 1600s mentioned red worms of the deep desert that emerged during droughts to defend their territory. Most accounts agreed on key points. The creatures were rare, perhaps solitary. They inhabited the deepest, driest parts of the Gobi. They could generate heat or electricity or something similar. They were territorial, responding to intrusion with escalating warnings, livestock kills, then displays of power, then attacks on humans. And they were intelligent, not animal cunning, true intelligence, problem-solving, communication through symbols in sand. I found one account that chilled me more than the others. A Buddhist monk's journal from 1723 described an expedition to map ancient trade routes. They'd camped near the southern wells for 3 weeks, ignoring local warnings. The olgoi-khorkhoi appeared on the 20th night. It killed 7 men in minutes, but spared the monk who was keeping watch at the time. The monk wrote that the creature had surfaced directly in front of him, close enough to touch, and he'd felt something in his mind. Not words, but meaning. A message. This land is not yours. Your kind cannot survive here. The sand remembers when you forget. Go north and do not return. The monk had fled. He'd spent the rest of his life at a monastery near Ulaanbaatar, refusing to speak about what happened. The journal was found after his death, sealed in a box marked with warnings in 3 languages. I showed this account to Tsarin over tea. He read it slowly, his expression unchanging, then handed it back. My grandfather said something similar, he finally said. He said when the olgoi-khorkhoi came for his sheep, he felt it in his head. Not thoughts, exactly. More like certainty, an absolute knowledge that he needed to leave immediately, or something worse would happen. He said it was the most terrified he'd ever been, but also the clearest message he'd ever received. Did he believe they were animals? I asked. Tsarin shook his head. He said they were guardians, that the deep desert has places humans shouldn't go, depths we shouldn't reach, and the olgoi-khorkhoi keep us out. They're not evil. They're just protective, like shepherds protecting flocks, except we're the wolves. I thought about that often in the weeks that followed. About Fletcher pulled screaming into the sand, about Volkov's frozen eyes, about Batterdine dying of fear-stopped heart. Protective seemed a generous term for creatures that killed with such efficiency. But then I thought about our survey work, our plans to run railway through that desert, to bring industry and exploitation to one of the last truly wild places on Earth. I thought about mines and stations and water depletions and all the ways humans consumed landscapes. Maybe protective was exactly the right word. Petrov came to see me in late July. Volkov had died 3 days earlier. Heart failure, the doctor said, though his heart had simply stopped while he sat staring at nothing. Petrov looked hollow, aged 20 years and 2 months. He insisted we speak in private, in my room at the consulate. "I need to tell someone," he said in accented English. Volkov and we weren't just observers. We were hunting for it, the olgoi-khorkhoi. I waited. The Tsar's naturalists believed these creatures could be weaponized. Imagine soldiers who could generate electricity or acids that melt steel. Russia wants specimens, live if possible. We were sent to find them, map their territory, develop capture methods. He laughed bitterly. Volkov was so confident. He'd hunted tigers in Siberia, bears in Kamchatka. He thought this would be the same. "What did he see?" I asked. "When it circled him? What happened in his mind?" Petrov's hands were trembling. He told me that first night after, before he stopped talking entirely. He said when the creature rose in front of him, he felt it in his skull. Not words, but images. He saw the desert as it truly is, not empty, but full. Full of things that burrow and wait. Ancient things. And he saw what they think of us. Which is food, eventually. But first, irritants. Insects crawling on the surface of their home. The olgoi-khorkhoi showed him what happens to insects that don't leave when warned. Petrov met my eyes. It showed him cities underground, Mr. Ashford. Tunnels that go down miles. Chambers that existed before humans left Africa. And things living there that make the olgoi-khorkhoi seem small. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. Volkov said the creature gave him a choice. Leave and live, or stay and understand. He tried to understand. I think that's what killed him. Not the shock, but the understanding. Some knowledge breaks the mind that holds it. After he left, I sat in my room watching the sun set over Ulaanbaatar's rooftops. I thought about cities underground, about guardians that had protected the deep desert for millennia, about the arrogance of thinking we could map and exploit and own every corner of the earth. I thought about Fletcher, who died without understanding, and Volkov, who'd understood too much, and Batterdine, who'd understood just enough to be properly afraid. The next morning, I went to the trading post and purchased supplies for the journey south. Saren found me there, among the dried meat and water skins, and his face went pale. "No," he said simply. "William, no. I need to see," I told him. Not to hunt or capture or exploit, just to see, to understand what we encountered. "You'll die. Maybe. Or maybe if I go alone, unarmed, with no tools or equipment or plans for railway, maybe they'll let me approach. Maybe they'll recognize I'm not a threat." Saren grabbed my arm, exactly where Batterdine had gripped it months before. My grandfather saw one, and it let him live. That gift kept him awake, screaming for years. He died afraid, William. Afraid of sand, afraid of silence, afraid of the dark. Is that what you want? I didn't have a good answer. I finished buying supplies. I left Ulaanbaatar 3 days later, alone, heading south into the Gobi. Tsarin came to see me off. He gave me a small leather pouch containing stones marked with Mongolian symbols. Protection charms, he said, though we both knew they were just symbols, not shields. If you survive, he said, tell the story right. Tell people the desert isn't empty. Tell them some places should remain unknown. I rode south for 6 days, following our old survey route until I reached the region where Fletcher died. The landscape was unchanged. Dunes and silence, heat and wind. I made camp at sunset exactly where our previous camp had stood. No fire, no lights. Just me sitting in the cooling sand, waiting. The sun set. Stars emerged in their thousands. I felt the subsonic vibration around midnight, that deep resonance in my chest and teeth. The sand began moving in ripples, circling my position, closer each pass. I didn't move, didn't reach for weapons I hadn't brought. I simply sat and waited and tried to project a simple message through intention alone. I come to understand, not to take. Show me what you want me to see. The ripples stopped 50 feet away. The vibration changed tone, went higher, and the sand in front of me exploded upward. The olgoi-khorkhoi rose into the starlight, massive and ancient and utterly alien. It oriented toward me, and I felt something press against my mind, not quite thought, not quite image. A presence, vast and patient and deeply, fundamentally other. I saw through its senses then, felt the desert as network of vibrations and heat signatures, felt the depth of the sand, the caverns beneath, the old places where water once flowed in underground rivers, felt the other olgoi-khorkhoi scattered across hundreds of miles, each one a sentinel, a guardian of depths humans had barely imagined. And I felt their memory. Not individual memory, but species memory, stretching back beyond human civilization, beyond the ice ages, to when this desert was an ocean floor and the first of their kind learned to burrow through primordial mud. They weren't worms, weren't animals in any conventional sense. They were something else. Something that had evolved in parallel to surface life, adapted to depths and pressures and energies we had no names for, and they were content in those depths, content to remain unknown, unencountered, guardians of the deep places. But humans kept pushing deeper, kept mining and drilling and excavating, kept disturbing the old depths for profit and curiosity and conquest, and eventually, the olgoi-khorkhoi would have no deeper to go. The presence withdrew from my mind. The creature sank back into the sand, ripples moving south. And I understood what Batardine had tried to tell me, what Volkov had learned too late. Some warnings are gifts. Some territories are marked not with hostility, but with mercy. Leave now, while leaving is still possible. Because the deep places have their own inhabitants, their own histories, their own rights to exist undisturbed. And if we don't listen, if we push too deep, take too much, disturb too often, eventually the guardians will stop warning and start defending. I rode back to Ulaanbaatar the next morning. I left Mongolia a month later, and I have never returned to the desert. But sometimes, in London, in my bed safe in my sister's house, I wake at midnight to that subsonic vibration in my chest. I feel the sand moving beneath me, though there is no sand. And I remember what waits in the deep places, patient and ancient and absolutely certain that someday, inevitably, humans will push too far. The Gobi keeps its secrets, and the olgoi-khorkhoi keep the Gobi. That's all the warning any of us deserve.